Okay. Sound.
Okay, come on, let's hurry.
Not dressed to hustle.
Oh,
When Charlotte and I heard that there was a woman in Chelsea not talking or eating, we were there in a New York minute.
And she's doing this for how long? 16 days. 24 hours a day. This is day 6. It gets worse. By changing my personal energy field, I'm attempting to change the energy field of this room, and perhaps that energy shift will shift the energy of the world. Good for her. So besties for lunch? When I was working in the galleries, performance art was more theater than installation. She's moved it to the next level.
Well, girlfriend needs to move a comb through her hair. She has company.
There's a man over there staring at me. Where? Over there.
Oh, he's not there.
Can you tell Cersei that Charlotte from his gallery on Spring Street sends her very best?
Sean Gallery.
Okay, that's him again. Oh my God. That's Alexander Petrovsky, the artist. He is the
Okay. We can stop it now. I think a lot of that what we discussed the last 2 years is said. The last 2 days is said here. You know, when they've been asking me to talk about Eastern European performance, I reminded that I somewhere in the 2003 or 2004 saw Marina Abramovic, the one that, so to say, invented performance art for the Western Museum in this Sex and the City episode from 2003. It tells almost everything. It tells about the construction of performance, about the intrusion of performance in the gallery space. It tells about the production means. It tells something about the gaze and the different construction of gazes. There is even this small gaze aside to the woman that seems to be someone coming from another audience, and so on and so on and so on. I could not avoid trying to find that yesterday evening, and to show you. Actually, I was asked to do something else. I was asked to do an introduction to a field that is so vast that it can't be introduced, namely to Eastern European performance art in the 1960s and early 1970s. So I choose to do some reenactment. This is a dress that has been designed by Angelo Litrico, an Italian designer whose fashion came to Moscow in 1956 with a great exhibition. And Khrushchev was so fascinated by Litrico that he asked him to design his clothes. So the famous shoe that Khrushchev in the Cuba crisis put at the auditorium of United Nations was designed by Angelo Litrico. But Angelo Litrico was not just the designer of Khrushchev. He, in the same period, designed suits for John F. Kennedy, Tito, and Nasser. So he was somehow the designer of the period. So let me reenact the period statesmen here, which already somehow complicates the issue of the block divide, because of the block divide is always imagined as a block divide, but it has not been in terms of the transmission and the transgression of certain fashions. So it was not just the fashion of high modernism, but it was the fashion, the fashion of avant-garde and neo-avant-garde as well, that somehow mingled, that traveled, that arrived through different means from both sides and has been somehow in a fruitful conversation. But that conversation broke off somewhere in 1980 when the American conceptual and performance paradigm created something like the idea of performance studies and of theory that then was formatted around a compound called the October compound. And suddenly all that what still could live together, for instance, in the Biennial of Paris or in other venues like in the museum in Sao Paulo, or in the Klugsberg collection in Argentina, or in shows that the Steirische Herbst did in Austria in the 70s, suddenly got eradicated because there was no proper theoretization of it, because of the West started to only look at itself. Well, that's maybe is a pretext. I mean, we could go back to yesterday's discussion for a lot of respects, and I think the one thing that we as well have to say, though there has been this transmission and transitory agents always going on, there has been a fundamental difference. And the fundamental difference was, and we did not discuss that properly yesterday, I think, production. Namely, the means of production and the possibilities of displaying the produced. So why we don't have a lot of histories around is because they have been produced in the absence of museums, and even in the absence of museums that could be addressed as the other museums, or that could be accused as the institution, because there was no way in the public to address the institution. That was somehow impossible, or it was put aside, like in the special case of Yugoslavia, but maybe I can talk about later. But there was a fashion in the 60s that was international, that was modernism of town planning and modernism of architecture. So the sets and the fashions and the ideas that have been circulating have been partly the same, but the production means have been totally different. Most of the material that is now at display and has been firstly shown in a huge exhibition in 2002 in the Museum of Ljubljana under the title The Body and the East, which was a counter project to Out of Actions that came from the States and somehow tried to globalize the action paradigm, was coming from the drawers. Most of that was coming from the drawers of artists, had to be collected there, as it has been as well performed in that second public, which was private spaces, which was half institutional spaces, or which was the public space, but in public space always with a certain idea of surveillance that would not allow it to act out so openly. Well, I have a written paper, and I think I should do it. And maybe it goes back. Can we have the next image? This, by the way, is by Julius Koller and Stano Filko. It has been a questionnaire that is sent out internationally in mail art about performance art and performativity. It has been sent out 1969. Can we, so I'll do it. How do I? How do I get to next image? How do I get it? Okay, here we are. You know the page. It's the page of a novel, actually, by Lawrence Stern. A novel that is the first. It's the first novel that somehow mingles in a non-Baroque way genres. This is the choreography of certain chapters that he draws into this novel. And I think Tristram Shandy is a good motif. I thought about that yesterday, and so I wrote a passage on that for this conference at all. In book 4, called The Long-Nosed Stranger of Strasbourg, Lawrence Stern opens with a collection of stories in Latin about noses. Tristram, as narrator, finds himself discoursing at length on sexual practices, siege, insult, the influence of one's name, and noses, as well as explorations of obstetrics and philosophy. Tristram is driven by a primary fantasy, the fantasy of escape from an imagined inevitable and absolute closure. Implicit in such fantasy is the belief that closure, in an ultimate sense, is itself possible. Both an imagined closure and an escape from it are two aspects of the same phantasmic polarity we have been discussing during the last 2 days. Each the negative of the other, amounting to the same thing. A polarity, not strictly speaking of that what you have called the performance turn here, but more precisely defining the limits of it. By tracing the derivatives of this fantasy against the backdrop of theory, the conference showed a kind of specular play between the two discourses, so that figure becomes ground and vice versa. We discover, read through Tristram, the Shandian backdrop, that there is an important sense in which these debates are generated, both theoretically and stylistically, by an identical fantasy of escape from closure, a fantasy that puts the issue in terms of the indestructibility of the unconscious desire of autonomy. Tristram is also organized on a grid whose axes are desire and closure, or more precisely, desire and end. Yet, unlike the narratives of happiness, in which our debate could close by forgetting something, thereby implicitly undermining the authority of the prospect, Tristram is concerned with precisely the opposite enterprise: to avoid closure at all costs, even if this means losing the integrity of the narrative itself. Both Tristram as a text and Tristram as a character are constituted by a battle against desire. Desire's always present telos, the end of itself. The conference, our conference, as a result, continually flees from the idea of closure. Well, let's go to performance art. This was a piece that Slovak artist Julius Koller performed in 1964 on the rooftop of his house in Bratislava. That was when he already had invented a system, an ontological system, so to say, to encapsulate his practice into the everyday of the socialist, of the Bit-Leiden socialist, everyday of the Czechoslovakian socialist state. He called this UFO, like the famous objects that have a conjuncture in the 60s as well. But UFO meant something totally different. It was a universal signifier that could change his name. But the general term above UFO was universal cultural futurological operations. These UFOs have occupied the art space above Bratislava since then. And when Koller was asked to be part for a commission for a monument, for one of these housing complexes, slab houses complexes. That was his proposition. So it was referring back to that small performative act that he did. Koller has been developing an artwork that oscillates between universal acceptance and skepticism, an art as compelling and erratic as it is playful and ironic. During the normalization years, Koller was one of the main protagonists of an unofficial Slovakian art scene. Repressively cursed with invisibility by the communist regime. Koller's nonlinear work evokes in continuous curves that fold into one another. So there is kind of a totality that he thinks about when he's performing. The performance is not just an act to be seen or an act to have an audience or an act of criticism, but it is an act within a never-ending signification process that tries to mark the everyday, that tries to free or somehow the everyday from the monumental, so to say, universalisms of modernism that he had to face in the communist regime. In this way, Koller, he called his pieces anti-happenings, by the way. Anti-happening. So they see he did not want to be a part of that international movement because he had something like totally the other in mind when he did these performances. He had in mind not to, so to say, create a turbulence in public space, but to create a signification of an otherness which was partly invisible. In this way, Koller's anti-happening presents conceptual actions or objects and creates cultural situations. Koller considers these demonstrative operations, as he calls them, as functional and emotional forms of using and occupying a place or a situation. In this, Koller finds, quote, the direct experience of the reality of the artwork, given back to the individual, escaping the socialist state apparatus and its designers and their cynical technoid fantasies of omnipotence. That's what he wrote around these pieces. And what he did, I just showed this one piece. You could go to a book Katrin Romberg has edited a few years ago and look at the performative pieces of Julius Koller. But the strategies that he uses are strategies of extension, elaboration, complication, equivocation, prolongation, procrastination, prevarication, teasing, lengthening, stretching out, and marking. The strategies, in short, are the same which derive of the logic of Tristram, I think, somehow. Okay. There has been another, maybe just to show it, there has been another, his counterpart, Stano Filko, whose archive is still to discover, did just the other thing. He really addressed, so to say, the apparatus of the of this modernity, of this transnational modernity, and what it did in the formation, so to say, of subjectivity in space, with his installations and performative spaces. This was a performance space that he built in the 1964 in a small gallery in Bratislava, and it really was about the being trapped, so to say, within this emblematics of the modernist language, and he really used models, Czechoslovak models, to play within that structure. Another of his pieces is he together with Koller and Mlynarczyk declared, it was in 1969, the whole public space of Bratislava as being a performance, from May 1 to May 8. It was the May days, you know, the famous May holidays, the May 1st to May 8th was the holiday day where the communists or the socialists, so to say, celebrated the Day of Labor, and May 8th was the end of the Second World War, the great victory. So they really declared the whole city space as a performative space. So they made something, again, like a marking act, a notation act, and did not perform on the streets. We shift contexts. Czechoslovakia was something specific because of it had this open period till 1968, and then it got from 68 to 70. There some things have been possible, but from 70 on, all the means of production more or less have been taken away from the artists. Different from Poland. Polish artists in the 70s had really a fantastic network of artists-run spaces, galleries, and so on, but the Czechs did not even have photo cameras or video cameras. That's why until 1989 there is almost no filmic and no video and no photo evidence of their practices. Besides small tourist photos that they could actually have. But the context that we are shifting now is totally different, and it's another erratic figure that has been misread in the West for his performances very often. It's Ion Grigorescu, and Ion Grigorescu works in Romania in the 1970s, and Romania is distinctly different from other Warsaw Pact countries because of his dictator place with the non-aligned third stream of Tito and Nasser, and he is quoted by the West as to be, so to say, one of the gatekeepers for intrusion. But as seen just only later, he implements the most horrific terror regime ever. Romania in the early 90s. Nicolae Ceausescu, who came to power in 65, has set out the short towing period after he took office. In domestic and cultural politics, the last residues of middle-class freedoms are getting cut. A personal policy dictated by paranoia is pulling the circles of powers tighter towards the clan of the party leader and president. By 1972, the media, along with all other organizations, are completely under the control of the powerful secret security. It is increasingly unclear to everybody who lives there who can be trusted and by whom. The public is simulated as a space of celebration. Critics who don't wish to leave the country or can't must, following the model of Stalin, live with repercussions. The psychiatric wards are notorious for being places where critics are confirmed. In this setting, from the beginning of the 1970s, Ion Grigorescu experiments within his Bucharest atelier. For Grigorescu, the figure of the body is the place, and its form is consumption. He reveals the political in every fissure, every crevice. It's the passageway that is always thinkable in terms of placing and obstructing, not as non-physical. So it is not the space like with the Czechs. It's really the body where he intrinsically, so to say, projects all the political conflicts on. The body for Grigorescu is the form and the force of the public, in which images of other dispositives of the collective space of Romania unfold their spectre-like existence. Grigorescu depicts all these notions in a singular theatralic act. It is an afternoon in the countryside, 1976. Grigorescu stages short actions in front of a camera. He splashes water in a stream, jumps with the help of a walking stick along a country lane, sits upon a log, and peers from a hill. In his studio, he prepares and reworks the photos that document the scene. He becomes the dragon-slaying St. George, the fallen angel. He projects the actions collage-like into the imaginative space of Orthodox iconography and develops referential allegories. The figure of the politically repressed that slyly takes arms against the overpowerful enemy, like David in Psalm 151. I would have liked to show 3 more examples or 4 more examples, but I just have 5 minutes. So we leave the last 5 minutes to maybe 2 videos that show the differently constructedness of the public space and the possibilities of artists as in Poland and in that what we used to call Yugoslavia. So maybe have the second video link. It is Poland in the 1970s is really a landscape, as I told, that has a lot of spaces, and performance is really done in the way that performance that we are used to see performance in the 70s in the Western world. And there are a lot of debates and interlocutions between them. But there is already an awareness of media. What you're seeing here is a study that the famous couple Georg Scho and their group did in the academy in Warsaw at the studio of Oscar Hansen in the surrounding of this open form paradigm. And I think it is a very intriguing piece because of it is the face of a then very, very famous Polish actress who played in a series like, as famous as Sex and the City. And they asked this person who had a public face, a real public face, to come to their studio and to give her face to be the playground for a collective action. The collective action plan was that the students in the studio have been asked to construct something like images on this public face, and there was something like a time frame of a few 5 minutes, yeah, and every 5 minutes the next group would take off from the former, so that there was a sequence in that piece. The interesting thing about Georg Scho is they did not understand their practice as neo-avant-garde, but they thought about being socialist artists that had to reform, so to say, the conservative modernism of the state. That's why they got somehow closed off a bit in visibility in the so-called Polish miracle after '89, because they have been called revachists for that reason. The people that had gone with Solidarność always thought that they are co-cooperators of the regime and so on and so on. But even this story is much more complicated to tell. Let me just end with a question that we had in the beginning, and that comes from a really theatrical context. So, who does... I'm looking for a video that I should have here. Okay, it doesn't seem to work here. No, I just eject and reject. That's my keyboard. Okay, we tried to do that, it doesn't work. Please put it away. I can maybe perform it once more. It is a video from Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia had this tradition of being one of the most fancy theater places then in the 70s. Huh? So now it's off, yeah? And the Bitte Festival was probably the most avant-garde festival in Western and Eastern Europe. Yeah, I show it then, come on. And around that festival, a young group of artists that have been gathered in the Students' Cultural Center actually started to experiment with the new paradigm of performance art. And it has been in the group there has been Marina Abramovic, it has been Goran Trubuljak, it has been Raza Dodošević, and some others. They really created something like a paradigm of performance art here. So why doesn't it show up? So you can put my monitor on. And they have been asking the same question as the woman in Sex and the City, and somehow the same question as our symposium in a famous action that Raza Dodošević did.
Was ist Kunst? 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 Kunst. Was ist Kunst?
It says, what is art?
Was ist Kunst?
In German.
Was ist Kunst? 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 Kunst. Was ist? Was ist Kunst? Kunst. Was ist Kunst? Kunst. Was ist Kunst? 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 Kunst. Was ist Kunst? Was ist Kunst? Was ist Kunst? Kunst. Was ist Kunst? Kunst. Was ist?
It lasts 15 minutes. Thanks for attention.